What if the greatest lie in Westerosi history had never been told? What if Lyanna Stark had survived the Tower of Joy, revealing the truth that could have shattered Robert Baratheon's rule and changed the fate of the Seven Kingdoms forever? Her death set off a chain of events that led to war, betrayal, and the near destruction of House Stark, but if she had lived, the entire history of Game of Thrones would have been rewritten. Would Jon Snow have grown up as the true heir to the Iron Throne? Would the North have ever rebelled? Would the war for the throne have ever begun at all? One woman's survival could have changed everything. Now let's start it. The history of Westeros is filled with moments that changed the fate of the Seven Kingdoms forever, but few were as pivotal as the life and death of Lyanna Stark. Though she appeared only briefly in Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire, her actions and fate were the catalyst for Robert's rebellion, the fall of the Targaryen dynasty, and the eventual political chaos that consumed Westeros. She was the younger sister of Ned Stark, the beloved of Robert Baratheon, and the secret wife of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. Her supposed kidnapping by Rhaegar was the justification for Robert's war against the Targaryens, a war that ultimately ended with the extinction of House Targaryen in Westeros, the crowning of Robert as king, and the ascension of House Baratheon to the Iron Throne. In the original timeline, Lyanna's story ended at the Tower of Joy, where she died shortly after giving birth to Jon Snow, secretly named Aegon Targaryen, the last true heir to the Targaryen dynasty. With her final breath, she made her brother Ned Stark promise to protect the child, knowing that Robert would stop at nothing to exterminate any remaining Targaryen heirs. To keep that promise, Ned lied to the world and claimed Jon as his own illegitimate son, raising him at Winterfell as a bastard to shield him from the vengeance of the new regime. But what if Lyanna had survived childbirth? What if, instead of dying in that lonely tower, she had lived to raise her son, speak the truth, and challenge the history that had already been written? The consequences of her survival would have reshaped the political landscape of Westeros in profound ways, altering the fates of not just Jon Snow, Robert Baratheon, and House Stark, but the entire realm itself. The world we know in Game of Thrones would have been unrecognizably different. The war that shaped Westeros, the relationships that defined noble houses, and even the battles against external threats like the White Walkers might have unfolded in radically changed ways. The survival of Lyanna Stark is one of the greatest what-if questions in A Song of Ice and Fire, and exploring this alternate reality offers a glimpse into how a single change could have rewritten the entire history of Westeros. If Lyanna had lived, would Robert Baratheon have ever become king? Would Jon Snow have ever been raised as a Stark bastard? Would the North have remained part of the Seven Kingdoms, or would it have fought for its own sovereignty? These are the questions that lie at the heart of this exploration. Lyanna Stark's survival and the immediate aftermath. In the true timeline, the battle at the Tower of Joy was one of the last violent conflicts of Robert's rebellion. Ned Stark and his companions faced off against three of the most elite warriors of the Kingsguard: Ser Arthur Dayne, Ser Oswell Went, and Ser Gerald Hightower, who had remained loyal to the fallen Prince Rhaegar and King Aerys II. The fight was brutal, and in the end, only two men survived, Ned Stark and Howland Reed. Inside the tower, Ned discovered his sister Lyanna lying in a bed soaked with blood, moments away from death after giving birth. In her last moments, she whispered her final words to Ned, entrusting her newborn son to him, making him swear to protect the child at all costs. Her death, along with Ned's decision to hide the boy's true identity, would shape the political future of Westeros for decades to come. But in this alternate timeline, Lyanna does not die. Though weakened from childbirth, she clings to life, giving her the opportunity to speak to Ned with clarity rather than fading away in her final breaths. This single change would have profound consequences. Instead of only hearing cryptic words and a desperate plea to protect the child, Ned would be able to learn the full truth about what had happened. Lyanna would have been able to explain, in detail, that she had not been kidnapped by Rhaegar, but had willingly run away with him. She would have told Ned that they were secretly married, that their union was legitimate, and that their child was not a bastard but a true-born Targaryen prince. She would have revealed Rhaegar's beliefs about prophecy, his conviction that their son was the prophesied prince that was promised, and that his birth was meant to save Westeros from an even greater threat than the war they had just fought. This revelation would have shattered Ned's understanding of the war he had just fought. Everything he believed to be true would have been turned upside down. He had fought against the Targaryens, believing that his sister had been taken against her will. His father, Rickard Stark, and his older brother, Brandon Stark, had both died seeking justice for what they believed was Lyanna's abduction. Thousands had perished in a war fought under a false pretense, a war that had wiped out House Targaryen from Westeros and placed Robert Baratheon on the Iron Throne. Ned, a man of unwavering honor, would have been faced with an impossible moral dilemma. Could he go back to Robert and tell him the truth, knowing that it would enrage him beyond reason? Could he risk revealing that Lyanna had loved Rhaegar, that their child was the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, and that the war had been based on a misunderstanding? Or would he recognize the danger and choose instead to hide the truth to protect his sister and nephew from Robert's fury? Ned's internal conflict would have been immense. On one hand, he would have been relieved to see his sister alive, but on the other, he would have been furious at her choices. Her decision to run away with Rhaegar had led to the deaths of their father and brother. It had led to the near extermination of House Targaryen and had plunged the Seven Kingdoms into chaos. Ned, ever the dutiful son and brother, would have had to weigh his loyalty to Lyanna against the reality of the bloodshed her actions had caused. Unlike in the true timeline, where he had no choice but to quietly raise Jon as his bastard, he would now have had to decide what to do with a living Lyanna, a child with a powerful claim to the throne, and a best friend who had sworn to kill every last Targaryen. The dilemma of Ned Stark, protecting Lyanna and her child. The survival of Lyanna would have placed Ned Stark in a far more complicated and dangerous position than in the original timeline. In the true timeline, his solution was simple: lie to protect Jon. He returned to Winterfell with a newborn and claimed him as his own bastard, knowing that as long as no one questioned his word, the boy would be safe. But if Lyanna had lived, this plan would not have been so easy. There would be no way to hide her presence, no way to quietly slip back to Winterfell with a child and an explanation that no one would question. Robert Baratheon was already on a warpath to eradicate every last Targaryen. He had ordered the execution of Rhaegar's other children, despite their innocence, and had celebrated their brutal deaths. He had no room in his heart for mercy when it came to the family he saw as his enemies. If he learned that Lyanna had survived and that she had borne Rhaegar's son, his rage would have been boundless. He might have seen it as the ultimate betrayal that the woman he had loved, the woman he had fought for, had chosen his greatest enemy over him. His hatred for Rhaegar would have transferred to the child, and there is no doubt that he would have sought to have the boy killed. Ned would have had only a few choices. He could have tried to smuggle Lyanna and her son into hiding, sending them somewhere Robert could never find them. He could have entrusted them to Howland Reed, whose castle at Greywater Watch was nearly impossible to find, or he could have sought refuge in Essos, where Lyanna and Jon could live in exile among Targaryen loyalists. However, any of these options would have been incredibly dangerous, and if Robert ever learned of Jon's existence, he would have hunted them to the ends of the earth. Another possibility would have been to try and negotiate with Robert to somehow convince him to spare Lyanna and the child. But given Robert's violent hatred for the Targaryens, this would have been nearly impossible. If Ned had tried, it is likely that Robert would have seen it as treason and turned against his best friend, setting up an entirely new conflict that could have torn Westeros apart before his reign even began. Would Jon Snow still be a secret? One of the most critical aspects of Lyanna's survival would be how Jon's identity was handled. In the real timeline, Ned protected Jon by raising him as a Stark bastard, ensuring that he remained hidden from Robert and the Lannisters. But with Lyanna alive, she would have had to make a choice about how to present her son to the world. Had she declared Jon as Aegon Targaryen, the true heir, it would have created instant chaos in Westeros. Robert Baratheon's hatred for the Targaryens was legendary, and he would not have tolerated the existence of Rhaegar's son. Even with Lyanna alive, Robert might have still ordered Jon's death, seeing him as a threat to his new rule. Alternatively, Lyanna could have worked with Ned to conceal Jon's identity in a different way. Rather than raising him as a bastard, she may have claimed him as a Stark, allowing him to grow up in Winterfell without the shame that haunted him in the real timeline. This would have fundamentally changed Jon's character. Without the weight of being a bastard, he may never have sought refuge in the Night's Watch, leading him down a different path entirely. The consequences of Lyanna going into hiding. If Lyanna Stark had gone into hiding after surviving childbirth, the fate of Westeros would have been profoundly altered. One of the most immediate and significant changes would have been the upbringing of Jon Snow. In the original timeline, Jon was raised as the supposed illegitimate son of Ned Stark, an identity that defined much of his early life. As a bastard, Jon faced constant feelings of alienation and struggled to find his place within House Stark. He was loved and respected by his siblings to varying degrees, but he was never truly accepted as an equal in the eyes of the world. His status as a supposed bastard shaped his personality, made him fiercely independent, and ultimately led him to seek a life of honor and duty in the Night's Watch. However, if Lyanna had gone into hiding and raised Jon herself, he would have grown up with the knowledge of his true parentage. Rather than living under the shadow of an unspoken lie, Jon would have had a strong sense of self from the very beginning. Growing up under his mother's care, Jon would not have carried the stigma of being a bastard, nor would he have been forced to constantly prove his worth to his adoptive family. Instead of being raised in Winterfell as an outcast, he might have been hidden in a remote stronghold, perhaps under the protection of Howland Reed at Greywater Watch, or even sent across the narrow sea to live among Targaryen loyalists. In either case, he would have been raised as Aegon Targaryen, the trueborn son of Prince Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark. With that knowledge, he would have grown up with a completely different mindset, one shaped not by shame and self-doubt, but by the awareness that he was the heir to a lost dynasty. This knowledge could have instilled in him a sense of destiny and responsibility far earlier in life, preparing him for a different path, one that could have eventually led him to reclaim his birthright as the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. With Jon absent from Winterfell, Ned Stark would have been freed from the burden of deception. In the original timeline, Ned's decision to claim Jon as his own illegitimate son was one of the greatest sacrifices of his life. He endured whispers and judgment for nearly 2 decades, all to protect the boy from Robert Baratheon's vengeance against House Targaryen. This lie, however noble its intent, placed an immense strain on Ned's relationship with his wife, Catelyn Stark. Catelyn, who was known for her unwavering sense of duty and loyalty to her family, could never fully forgive or understand why her honorable husband had seemingly broken his vows. She resented Jon's presence in Winterfell and treated him as an outsider, which in turn created an emotional divide between Jon and the rest of the Stark family. If Jon had never been brought to Winterfell, Ned and Catelyn's marriage would have been free of this lingering source of conflict. Without the presence of an alleged bastard in their home, Catelyn would have had no reason to harbor resentment or suspicion, and the bond between her and Ned would likely have been much stronger. The absence of Jon would have also significantly affected the childhoods of Arya, Sansa, Robb, Bran, and Rickon. In the original timeline, Jon's presence as a supposed bastard created an unspoken hierarchy among the Stark children. While Robb, the legitimate heir, was raised with the expectations of a future lord, Jon was left on the fringes of the family, never fully included in the discussions of inheritance and duty. Arya, who struggled with the rigid expectations placed on noble women, found a kindred spirit in Jon, and their close relationship was one of the most genuine in the Stark family. He was the one who gifted her needle, the small but deadly sword that became an integral part of her identity. Without Jon in Winterfell, Arya might never have received that gift, and her journey into becoming a fierce warrior might have taken a different path. Sansa's perspective on Jon would have been irrelevant in this new reality, as she would have never grown up in the same household as him. In the original timeline, she saw Jon as nothing more than a low-born bastard, someone unworthy of the noble status that she aspired to. Without Jon present in her early life, she may have grown up even more deeply entrenched in her courtly ideals, with no exposure to the struggles of those without noble privilege. Meanwhile, Robb, as the eldest legitimate son, would have never had to balance his role as heir with his unspoken brotherhood with Jon. In the original timeline, Robb and Jon shared a close but complicated bond, with mutual respect but a clear social divide between them. Without Jon, Robb's sense of responsibility as the eldest Stark son might have been even more pronounced, reinforcing his belief in duty and leadership. Bran and Rickon, the youngest of the Stark children, would have never known Jon at all. Their childhoods would have been largely unaffected in the early years, but the long-term consequences would have been significant. In the original timeline, Jon's presence as an older brother figure influenced Bran's early sense of curiosity and courage. Without him, Bran's emotional support system might have been weaker, potentially altering his outlook on his abilities and destiny. Beyond the personal changes within House Stark, Jon's absence from Winterfell would have altered the course of history in major ways. One of the most profound changes would have been his absence from the Wall. In the original timeline, Jon's decision to join the Night's Watch was driven by his feelings of alienation and his desire to prove himself outside the confines of noble society. He saw the Watch as a place where he could earn honor, independent of his bastard status. However, if he had been raised with the knowledge of his true heritage, he would have had no reason to seek refuge in the Night's Watch at all. Without Jon at the Wall, key events would have unfolded differently. The friendships he formed with Samwell Tarly, Grenn, and PYP would have never existed. He would not have been there to protect Lord Commander Mormont from the Whites, nor would he have become the leader who united the Night's Watch with the Free Folk. The Battle of Castle Black, the defense against Mance Rayder's invasion, and the eventual war against the White Walkers would have played out in unpredictable ways. If Jon had not been there to gain the trust of the Free Folk, would the Night's Watch have ever successfully allied with them? Would the wildlings have perished at the hands of the White Walkers, or would they have continued their desperate attempts to breach the Wall in search of safety? Without Jon's leadership, the Night's Watch might have been overrun, and the war against the undead might have taken a drastically different turn. Jon's absence would have also altered the political landscape of Westeros. In the original timeline, his secret Targaryen lineage became a key revelation in the final seasons of Game of Thrones, reshaping alliances and fueling the conflict between Daenerys Targaryen and the Starks. If he had been raised with the knowledge of his heritage, he might have emerged as a Targaryen claimant much earlier, potentially challenging Robert Baratheon's rule or even forging alliances with other Targaryen loyalists. Ultimately, Lyanna's decision to go into hiding with Jon would have created an entirely new chain of events. The Starks would have remained a unified household, free of the tension caused by Jon's alleged bastard status. The Night's Watch would have been without one of its greatest leaders, and the fight against the White Walkers might have been lost without Jon's influence. The Targaryen claim to the throne would have remained hidden for much longer, possibly changing the balance of power in Westeros forever. In a world where Jon Snow had never been raised as a Stark, the fate of the Seven Kingdoms would have been dramatically different, and the legacy of House Targaryen might have played out in an entirely new way. Lyanna marries Robert Baratheon. Another possibility is that instead of going into hiding, Lyanna Stark might have agreed to marry Robert Baratheon in an effort to protect herself and her child. This choice would have required her to completely rewrite her own history, erasing her love for Rhaegar Targaryen and pretending that she had been an unwilling captive rather than a willing partner in their secret marriage. To the world, she would have had to claim that Rhaegar had kidnapped and assaulted her, that she had been a helpless maiden in distress waiting to be rescued. For a woman as strong-willed as Lyanna, this deception would have been agonizing. To protect her son and secure her own safety, she would have had to denounce the man she loved, betray his memory, and embrace a life she had never wanted. This decision would have had massive political ramifications, reshaping the power structure of Westeros entirely. If Lyanna had returned to King's Landing as Robert Baratheon's queen, House Stark would have gained immense influence, becoming one of the most powerful houses in the realm. Unlike in the original timeline, where the Starks remained in the north and only held indirect sway over the throne, Lyanna's marriage to Robert would have made them the ruling family alongside the Baratheons. This means that Cersei Lannister would never have become queen, preventing House Lannister from gaining its stranglehold over the Iron Throne. Without Cersei in power, Tywin Lannister's ambitions would have been severely hindered. Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella would never have been born, completely altering the line of succession and removing some of the most notorious figures in Westerosi history from the equation. Robert Baratheon himself might have been a very different man if he had won the war and married the woman he had fought so desperately for. In the original timeline, Robert's obsession with Lyanna consumed him even decades after her death. He never recovered from her loss, and his grief led him to become a bitter, self-destructive ruler. He drowned himself in wine, surrounded himself with whores, and ruled Westeros with reckless abandon, uninterested in the responsibilities of kingship. If Lyanna had lived and married him, this downward spiral might never have occurred. With the woman he believed to be his one true love by his side, he might have been a happier, more stable man. He might have remained physically strong, continued to train as a warrior, and taken a more active role in ruling the realm rather than delegating power to corrupt advisors. However, despite this potential for a more stable Robert, his nature as a womanizer would not have changed. Even with Lyanna alive, Robert's habits of drinking, fighting, and sleeping with other women would have continued. Lyanna, who had already expressed distaste for Robert's unfaithfulness before the rebellion even began, would likely have come to despise him over time. She had never wanted to marry him in the first place, and now she would have been forced into a lifelong union with a man she neither loved nor respected. Their marriage would have been cold and strained, and though Robert would have adored her, his reckless behavior and infidelity would have driven a wedge between them. Over time, Lyanna might have found herself feeling trapped in a life she never wanted, forced to play the role of a devoted queen while silently suffering in her own misery. One of the biggest questions in this alternate reality is the fate of Jon Snow. If Lyanna had chosen to marry Robert, what would she have done with her son? There is no world in which Robert Baratheon would have accepted Jon as his own child, knowing that he was Rhaegar Targaryen's son. Robert's hatred for the Targaryens ran too deep, and he had already ordered the brutal murder of Rhaegar's other children, even the innocent ones. If he discovered that Lyanna had borne Rhaegar's child, his reaction would have been violent and merciless. He would have seen the boy as a threat to his rule, a reminder of the man he hated above all others, and he would have had him killed without hesitation. To protect Jon, Lyanna would have had to make the heartbreaking choice to send him away. She could never have kept him by her side in the Red Keep, not even under a false identity. There would always be the risk that someone would discover the truth, whether it was through the child's resemblance to Rhaegar, the whispers of those who knew Lyanna's secret, or the political maneuvering of enemies looking to weaken Robert's rule. To ensure Jon's survival, Lyanna would have had to hide him, perhaps sending him to be raised in secrecy by someone she trusted, like Howland Reed or another Stark bannerman. This would have been an incredibly painful decision for her. She had already lost Rhaegar, and now she would be forced to give up her son, never to see him grow up, never to hold him or teach him about his true heritage. If Jon had been sent away, his life would have taken a drastically different path. Without the guidance of Ned Stark, without growing up alongside his Stark siblings, he would have had an entirely different upbringing. Would he have been raised as a commoner, unaware of his true lineage, growing up in obscurity until fate called him back into the larger world? Or would he have eventually learned of his birthright and sought to reclaim his place in the Seven Kingdoms? If he had been hidden across the narrow sea, he might have grown up among Targaryen loyalists, perhaps even aligning himself with Daenerys Targaryen, who was exiled in Essos. In that case, Jon and Daenerys could have united as true Targaryens, rallying their supporters to reclaim the Iron Throne together. Meanwhile, back in Westeros, Robert's reign would have continued on a very different trajectory. Without Cersei's influence, the court would have been far less corrupted by Lannister schemes. The realm might have been more stable, with House Stark holding significant power and influence. The Lannisters, denied their royal marriage, would have remained powerful in their own right, but they would not have had the same control over the throne that they enjoyed in the original timeline. However, the political stability of Robert's reign would have always been fragile, hanging by a thread that could snap at any moment. Lyanna's presence as queen would not have erased the deep-seated rivalries and unresolved conflicts left in the wake of the rebellion. If Robert ever discovered that Lyanna had lied about her captivity, that she had truly loved Rhaegar and had willingly married him, his reaction would have been explosive. He would have felt deeply betrayed, not just by Lyanna, but by Ned Stark as well. Such a revelation could have led to a renewed conflict, tearing apart the fragile peace that had been established. In the end, Lyanna's choice to marry Robert Baratheon would have reshaped Westeros in ways both expected and unforeseen. The Stark-Baratheon alliance would have been stronger than ever, but Lyanna herself would have suffered in a loveless marriage, forced to pretend for the sake of survival. Jon Snow would have lived, but he would have grown up far from his mother's side, with an uncertain destiny ahead of him. Robert might have been a more stable king, but his personal flaws would have persisted, leading to eventual turmoil within the kingdom. Had Lyanna taken this path, Westeros would have avoided some of the devastating wars that plagued it in the original timeline, but it would have created an entirely new web of conflicts and betrayals. The story of Game of Thrones would have been rewritten from the very beginning, with new alliances, new enemies, and a different king and queen ruling over the Seven Kingdoms. Whether this alternate reality would have been better or worse is impossible to say, but one thing is certain: the fate of Westeros would have been forever changed. The conflict between Lyanna Stark and Robert Baratheon. Robert Baratheon had always idolized Lyanna, believing her to be the perfect woman, beautiful, fierce, and meant to be his. He spent years mourning her death, convincing himself that she had been taken from him and using that belief as fuel for his hatred of the Targaryens. If Lyanna had lived and revealed that she had willingly chosen Rhaegar, Robert's entire world would have crumbled. He would have realized that the war he fought, the blood he spilled, and the vengeance he sought had all been based on a lie. His love for Lyanna would have turned into rage and bitterness, and he might have never recovered from the betrayal. This could have led to a second war, one fought not against the Targaryens, but between former allies. House Stark and House Baratheon may have turned against each other, with Ned standing by his sister's side to protect Jon, while Robert sought to eliminate the last Targaryen bloodline. Such a conflict would have destabilized the newly established rule of Robert Baratheon, leaving the Seven Kingdoms in a state of turmoil. How House Stark's future would have changed. In the real timeline, House Stark suffered immense losses after Robert's rebellion, despite technically fighting for the victorious side. Though Eddard Stark returned to Winterfell as Warden of the North, the scars of the war ran deep. He carried with him the tragic secret of Jon Snow's true parentage, a burden that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His decision to claim Jon as his illegitimate son created a lasting strain within his family, particularly in his marriage to Catelyn Stark. Catelyn, a woman deeply devoted to honor and duty, never forgave what she perceived as Ned's betrayal. Though she remained a loyal wife, she could never fully accept Jon as part of the family, treating him as an outsider in his own home. This coldness, coupled with Jon's own sense of shame as a supposed bastard, led him to seek his own path outside of Winterfell, eventually taking the Black and joining the Night's Watch. But if Lyanna Stark had survived, the entire dynamic of House Stark would have changed. Instead of growing up under the shadow of secrecy, Jon would have been openly acknowledged as Lyanna's son. The circumstances of his upbringing would depend entirely on how Lyanna chose to navigate the political dangers surrounding her child. If she had gone into hiding with Jon, House Stark's future would have remained relatively unchanged, with Ned returning to Winterfell alone. But if Lyanna had remained in Westeros and publicly claimed Jon as her son, everything about the future of the Stark family would have taken a vastly different course. The most significant impact of Lyanna's survival would have been on Jon's status within House Stark. In the original timeline, Jon was raised as a dishonored bastard, forever marked by his supposed illegitimacy. Though he was given the Stark name and raised in Winterfell, he was always treated as a step below his trueborn siblings. This affected his relationships with all of them in different ways. Robb loved Jon as a brother, but there was always an unspoken understanding that Jon could never be his equal. Sansa, shaped by the expectations of Southern court life, looked down on Jon as an embarrassment to her family's name. Arya, who struggled with the restrictive roles imposed upon noble women, connected with Jon because they were both outsiders in their own way. If Jon had been raised openly as Lyanna's son, these relationships would have been entirely different. Without the stain of bastardy, Jon would have been viewed as a legitimate member of the Stark family. He would have grown up with the same status and privileges as Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon, forging stronger bonds with them. Instead of being an outcast, he would have been a true heir of Winterfell, securing a powerful place in the family's future. If Lyanna had been able to prove her marriage to Rhaegar, Jon would have been seen as not only a Stark, but also a Targaryen, making him an even more significant political figure. This could have given House Stark an unbreakable claim to both the North and, potentially, the Iron Throne itself. One of the most dramatic consequences of Lyanna's survival would have been the possible prevention of the War of the Five Kings. In the original timeline, this devastating conflict was triggered by Ned Stark's execution, which in turn was a result of his involvement in the dangerous power struggles of King's Landing. If Lyanna had been alive, Ned might never have been drawn into the Lannisters' web of political intrigue in the first place. His primary reason for traveling south was to serve as Hand of the King at Robert Baratheon's request. But if Lyanna had been Robert's wife, or if she had played a role in keeping House Stark distanced from the royal court, Ned might have never needed to leave Winterfell at all. Even if Ned had still accepted the role of Hand of the King, the political landscape would have been vastly different. Without the Lannisters holding the same level of influence, since Cersei would never have married Robert, there would have been fewer threats surrounding Ned's position. If House Stark had been more closely tied to the throne through Lyanna, the need for Ned to investigate the legitimacy of Robert's heirs might never have arisen, eliminating the chain of events that led to his execution. Without Ned's death, Robb Stark would have never declared himself king in the North, meaning the North would have never gone to war against the Lannisters. The absence of the War of the Five Kings would have meant that many of House Stark's greatest tragedies never occurred. The Red Wedding, one of the most infamous betrayals in Westerosi history, never would have happened. Robb, Catelyn, and countless Stark bannermen would have never been massacred. Winterfell itself might never have fallen into the hands of the Boltons, sparing the North from years of suffering under Ramsay Bolton's sadistic rule. Sansa Stark would have never been forced into a series of traumatic marriages, and Arya would not have had to flee into exile. Bran and Rickon might have lived peacefully in Winterfell, never needing to go into hiding to escape Theon Greyjoy's invasion. If Jon had been recognized as both a Stark and a Targaryen, it's possible that he would have played a key role in uniting the North and the South without bloodshed. If House Stark had openly acknowledged Jon's Targaryen lineage, they might have leveraged that connection to influence the throne rather than rebelling against it. With Lyanna alive to confirm Jon's parentage, the North could have gained legitimacy as a major power in the realm without needing to secede or fight a war. In this scenario, Jon might have been raised not just as a Stark of Winterfell, but as a potential heir to the Iron Throne itself. However, even in this alternate reality, the question of Jon's true place within House Stark would have remained a complicated issue. If Lyanna had declared Jon as her son but had not revealed his Targaryen heritage, he would have been viewed as a full Stark, possibly even as the heir to Winterfell if Ned had no sons of his own. This could have created friction between Jon and Robb, much like the rivalry between Rhaegar and his younger brother Viserys. Though the Starks were known for their unity, the weight of inheritance and political ambition has a way of creating divisions even among the strongest families. If Jon had been raised with full Stark status but had no real claim to the throne, he might have lived in Robb's shadow, struggling to carve out his own path in the world. Alternatively, if Jon had been publicly acknowledged as both a Stark and a Targaryen, his future would have been even more uncertain. Would the North have truly accepted a boy with Targaryen blood as their lord? The North had always been fiercely independent, wary of the influence of the South. If Jon had been seen as too much of a Targaryen, some northern lords might have resisted his rule, fearing that he would eventually seek to impose Targaryen dominance over the North. In this alternate history, the fate of Westeros might have depended on Jon's ability to navigate his dual heritage. Would he have remained loyal to Winterfell, embracing his Stark roots and ruling as Warden of the North? Or would he have been drawn into the greater Game of Thrones, seeking to reclaim his place as the rightful heir of House Targaryen? Would he have aligned himself with Daenerys Targaryen in her eventual quest to reclaim the Iron Throne, or would he have remained a figure of the North, shaping its destiny as a leader in his own right? Ultimately, Lyanna's survival would have changed House Stark's future in ways both obvious and unforeseen. The family would have been spared the tragedies of the War of the Five Kings, and Jon Snow would have grown up with a secure place in the world rather than as an outcast. Ned Stark might have lived, Robb might have ruled in peace, and the North might have remained untouched by war. However, even in this more stable timeline, Jon's identity would have remained a question of fate, and the struggle between his Stark and Targaryen bloodlines might have defined his destiny in a completely different way. A Westeros forever changed. The survival of Lyanna Stark would have rewritten the history of Westeros. Whether she disappeared into hiding, raised Jon in secret, or married Robert and reshaped the court, her presence would have changed the trajectory of the world. Jon Snow's identity as Aegon Targaryen would not have remained hidden for long, and the political battles of the Seven Kingdoms would have played out in vastly different ways. In the end, Lyanna's death at the Tower of Joy was the catalyst for so much of the suffering and conflict that followed. If she had lived, the balance of power in Westeros would have been forever altered, and the Game of Thrones itself might have had a completely different victor.